just to refresh your memories, this is 13% of regular drug users in the U.S. Are African American. 35% of those arrested for drug-related crimes, but 74% of those sent to prison. Right. So I was asking why that might be. What sorts of explanations can we think of for this? There are many explanations for this. One contributing factor would be racial profiling, and so I want to think a little bit about that. And I have a short video. Let's see if I can get this to work to start us off. Because who doesn't like to start class with a video?
Controversy in a lot of cities all across the country. Back in the 1960s, the Supreme Court ruled that police may stop and search anyone they find suspicious. Minorities say they are often singled out. We asked Jim Axelrod to look at this with the nation's largest police department in New York City.
Right over there.
10 months ago, Nicholas Pert was walking up his block in Harlem on his way to the corner deli when he says he was stopped and frisked by police. And literally they had you up against the wall.
Yes. Had me up against the wall for it. I was that close to my destination.
And you started about less than 100 yards down the block here.
Yes. They see me come out my building.
After an ID check, Pert, a 23-year-old college student who's never been in trouble with the law, was released. Just like the other half-dozen times, he says the same thing happened to him over the last 7 years.
Walking while black in my community, and I'm stopped for...
That's the only offense?
Only offense.
Walking while black.
Yes.
What do you feel like when you walk away from having that happen?
I feel hopeless and violated.
We have the lowest murder rate of any city in America.
New York's Police Commissioner Ray Kelly defends what's called the stop and frisk policy, which allows officers to detain anyone who they find suspicious. The policy was put in place decades ago to combat a spike in violent crime. NYPD statistics show 66% of violent crime suspects are African American. The city claims 53% of those stopped under stop and frisk were black. Just 6% were arrested.
What we're trying to do is save lives. And the stop and question tactic is certainly not the be-all and end-all, but it's one of the strategies that we use to reduce violence.
So what I hear you saying is if innocent people get stopped repeatedly, that's just the price of doing business.
Well, we certainly hope that it doesn't happen. We hope that they understand that we think this is an effective strategy of reducing violence.
Police officials might say, look, this is how we keep the neighborhood safe.
They're creating distrust in the community, and no one wants to have anything to do with them.
Stop and frisk certainly has its share of critics in the New York State Legislature. In fact, right now, a number of African American and Latino lawmakers are trying to gather enough support, Scott, to outlaw the practice.
Jim, thank you.
The volume, turn that back down. Is that good? I may not look it, but I'm not that savvy. Okay. So, how many of you have heard of New York City's stop and frisk policy before? As you can see, it's made the news quite a bit. There have been some important changes that have happened in the last few months in relation to it as well. But it's a policy that existed for a good 10 years, right, 2004 to the present. These statistics are from, looks like 2011, right? And what you can see is one of the things that the police department official in the video sort of sidesteps this issue a bit. But one of the things that's pretty undeniable is the extent to which stop and frisk has been implemented in a way that has disproportionately targeted blacks and Latinos in relation to their percentage of the population, in particular African Americans. And we talked about two ways that this happens in class on Monday, right? One is through direct racial profiling, where I see someone walking down the street and that person is black, and so I stop them. In New York City, right, particularly in the neighborhoods where this is happening, where you actually have a really high percentage of the population that are black. And so it's not so much that someone's being singled out for being black, but that someone's being singled out for living in a neighborhood that is predominantly African American, right? So what you have are instances where stop and frisk tactics are being deployed selectively throughout the city. And so they're being done primarily in neighborhoods where there are high minority populations or concentrations. So here we have New York City population, 25% black, South by NYPD, 53% black, right? So there's a huge disproportionality there. Now, one of the things in the CBS News report that you saw there was, well, 66% of suspects in violent crimes are African Americans. So maybe we should be targeting African Americans. Of course, the key word there, right, is suspect, right? 66% of suspects are African American because they're stopping mostly African Americans to look for crime, right? So what they didn't give you was what conviction rates were, right? When you look at conviction rates, what you find is that 5% of those who are stopped and frisked were actually convicted of a crime. So there are all kinds of questions that come up in the challenges of stop and frisk, including the questions of effectiveness, right? The 5% conviction rate justify the other kinds of collateral costs that you see the young man describing in terms of deterioration of community police relations and lack of faith in the criminal justice system. Another tactic that was, or another sort of challenge that was brought up in the video is specifically the racial impact of the policy. So it turns out that particular, there's also constitutional questions, sorry. There are also constitutional questions about the legitimacy of this tactic. So the specific challenge that was mentioned in the video with lawmakers in New York State trying to outlaw the practice didn't end up going anywhere. There were court challenges, however, that ended up resulting in courts issuing stays and challenges to the police department saying they need to justify the practice before they can continue it. These were mostly decided on constitutional grounds, but also civil rights grounds. The city challenged or sort of fought and appealed those challenges. There's an interesting sort of story about how stop and frisk moved through the courts. But what ended up happening this last year, New York City has a new mayor, a new chief of police, and they have both said that they feel like this policy went too far. And so what's happening currently in 2014 is that New York City is saying that it's going to reduce the use of stop and frisk as a police policy. So there you have that. This issue largely came to national attention a couple years ago, not so much because of people being stopped in New York City, but more because of a case that took place in Florida, the Trayvon Martin case, which many of you, how many people have heard of Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman? Okay, filled in there. So the question here, right, hinges on what justifies police attention, right? Or in the case of George Zimmerman, kind of para-police attention, right? Sort of people who are not legally part of the police, but see themselves in some way or are officially deputized in some way to be acting in a para-police kind of fashion. So again, some of the readings for next week are going to circle back to this and think about the psychological components and how people make decisions about who looks suspicious, who seems to be up to no good. You've probably all heard many of these sorts of things debated in the media. I'm going to give you one more take on this, not by insurance. If I can get this
black men. But what about the other side of the coin? White privilege. Joining us now from New York is Michael Skolnick, the editor-in-chief of GlobalGrind.com. Michael, thank you. Do you agree that there is such a thing, and we've been hearing a lot about it now, as white privilege? Is that real?
Of course it's real, and I'm white and I have it. I can walk in the street in New York City and put my hand out and no taxi will pass me by. I can walk in the street and no woman's going to grab my purse in fear of me. I can walk into a restaurant and no one's going to ask me to pay before I eat. I can walk through my neighborhood and no one's going to call 911 and say I look suspicious. I wore a hoodie, I wore a pair of jeans, a pair of white tennis shoes this weekend, as I do every weekend, and no one's ever going to stop and say, hey, that guy looks suspicious. It's for one reason and one reason only, because I'm white. And Don, and further, let's say one last thing, Don, furthermore, I have the privilege to never look suspicious. That's an incredible privilege to have. I will never look suspicious to anyone, regardless of what I'm wearing, because of my skin color.
Where did this concept of white privilege come from?
Well, I think the idea of white privilege come from is white people have been in power for hundreds and hundreds of years. And because white people, we've been in power for hundreds and hundreds of years, we think that we have the right to do whatever we want. I look at a young man like Trayvon walking through his neighborhood, his father's neighborhood, with a bag of Skittles and a can of iced tea, and another man looks at him, regardless of his skin color, that young black men look suspicious because of the color of their skin is wrong.
Is it something that's innate? People say, well, you don't know. I've had many women say, you don't know what it's like to be a woman, Don, because you're not a woman. You don't know what it's like to be black because you're not black, or white because you're not white. Is it something that's so innate and so pervasive that people just don't even understand that there is something as the concept of white privilege and that they're in it?
Yeah, well, I wrote a piece on GlobalGrind.com called White People You Never Look Suspicious Like Trayvon Martin. The reason why I wrote it is as a white person, we have to begin to understand, I don't feel guilty for being white. I'm not ashamed of being white. It was the hand that I was dealt. It was the card that came out of the deck. It's what I got. But when I got that, when I was lucky enough to be a man, to be white, to be an American, I got choices to make. The choices that I'm going to make is I'm not going to be quiet. I'm not going to watch a kid get shot in the chest and just be quiet. 3 weeks ago, when Joseph Kony, when that movement started, all my white friends were loud and screaming and tweeting and Facebooking and emailing. Did you hear about Joseph Kony? When a 17-year-old black kid was killed in our country, white people were just quiet. And Don, it was you. It was you. It was Charles Blow. It was Melissa Harris Perry on MSNBC. It was black commentators were talking about it. And I said, why do they have to talk about it? Why can't white people stand up and say, this is just as wrong?
Yeah. Well, and I'll answer that. I think it's a matter of, in all honesty, some did. I mean, because actually CBS News was the first one to do the story. But I think it is because it's diversity. There are things, if you work in, let's say you work with the economy, you work on Wall Street, things that are in reference to the economy or economics are going to stand out to you and you're going to follow that. If you're an African American in this country and you see a story like that, it is by nature something that you're going to pay attention to. It has nothing to do with that. That is where your interest lies in some respect. If you're a woman and there is a woman issue, then you are going to be drawn to that story. It's just a diversity issue. So, I agree with you on that comment. But here's what I'd like to know. I heard a Republican commentator on another channel, I'll just be honest, it was Joe Scarborough this morning on MSNBC saying, and so the first time it really clicked with me, if you took the pictures of Trayvon Martin and you transposed them into a 17-year-old white kid, and then you transposed George Zimmerman into a 28-year-old black man that's twice the size, how would you feel about this particular story, and how would it be portrayed? And how would you look for guilt or innocence on the part of each side?
I hear this conversation a lot. Let's be honest. We're not going to be back here in 3 weeks talking about white kids being killed at record numbers. We're not going to be talking about white kids being stopped and frisked in New York City at record numbers. We're not going to come back to CNN and talk about white people being put in prison at record numbers. We know, if we're going to be honest with each other, if we're going to be honest about this country, we want to walk that elephant out of the room, which is race in this country. Let's be honest. And let's at least agree that young black men, young brown men, young Latino men are being targeted in every neighborhood in this country, every community in this country. I am not going to walk through my neighborhood in Brooklyn tonight, have to worry about the police following me because I look suspicious. It's just not going to happen. Yeah. So yes, if a black man killed a white kid, is it just as wrong? Of course it is. If he racially profiled that white kid, of course it is. Of course it is. But that's not going to happen at the numbers that's happening with young black men.
And Michael, I have to go, but just from this conversation, people should not draw the conclusion that we're speaking of the guilt or innocence of George Zimmerman. That is a different conversation when we're weighing.
Absolutely different conversation.
Yeah.
Absolutely different conversation.
We can have these conversations.
He's innocent until proven guilty in my book, and we should have due process, and he should be arrested, and we should let it go before his peers.
And there are many white people who think the same way that you do, and I've heard from them a lot. Thank you, Michael
Thanks, Don.
Skolnick, Chief Editor, Editor-in-Chief of Global Grind.
Okay. Wrong direction. Okay. So I passed out the PC mentions from globalgrind.com. There are not enough for everyone. I apologize. It's also on Blackboard. But I wanted to sort of give you something physical. And before I pass it out, I meant to say share it, but let's do it now. So I wanted to give you a sense of the quizzes for this class and the kinds of questions you might be asked. So if you were to get this reading, or basically the reading says a lot of the things he said in his video, you might come into class the next day and have a question like this, right? So it's not strictly speaking asking for you to memorize some kind of statistics or something. It's more a question of comprehension, right, of the reading, right? How well can you describe the substantive main point of it? So in this case, how does Michael Skolnick believe that white privilege is relevant to the case of George Zimmerman's shooting of Trayvon Martin? So if this were your quiz question today, what might you answer? Yes?
If being a 17-year-old white male, he probably wouldn't have been shot because he might not have been seen as suspicious because he had white privilege.
So white privilege protects certain people from being targeted as suspicious in the first place, right? Which is what led to Trayvon Martin's death, right? So that's the right direction. I might want you to, or the graders, might want you to expand a little bit more on the generality of the concept there. So, right, what you gave me was a kind of example that was used rather than the sort of principle behind the example. How else might you respond? There's multiple answers here. Yes?
In white privilege, there's possibly an elevated sense of like authority and justification on their choices, their legal choices. So like Zimmerman's case, and then the alliance with the law because it is based around whiteness.
Say a little bit more.
So just I know what a criminal looks like is justified very much in white minds because it's the elevation of privilege and being good in the law. So you may have a sense of what justice is.
So it could play into the defense, right?
Yeah.
Into the defense, right? To argue that somehow white privilege is informing that insofar as Zimmerman is not black, right? How else might white privilege be playing in here? Yes.
These things that black people are perceived as guilty and suspect, and that's why Trayvon Martin was targeted. That's how that's relevant, and that white people would not be subject to that same kind of I want to say retaliation, but that's obviously going on.
Yeah, targeting or
Targeting.
yeah. So again, it's kind of a lot of these answers are hinging on Trayvon Martin's lack of white privilege, right? And of course, in this situation, Zimmerman there's debate about Zimmerman's whiteness and his relationship to whiteness as well. So what else does Skolnick say about white privilege in the video here? Yes.
Well, he's not just talking about Trayvon Martin or anything important justice theory regarding that case. He's just talking about how black and white is presented to us in media. At least that's part of what I got from it and this conversation that he has. That what did he say? Whatever he said about like his white friends were saying all these things about just money and blah blah blah. And that how both in like what the story that's actually told and whose side of the story, and like from what like him as like a person, his life, that like his side before I ever did anything with Trayvon Martin. And I think that like I know that his whiteness, George Zimmerman's whiteness is debatable and there's controversy regarding that, but like I think that that still says a lot about like how we perceive white privilege, that we heard first about like the supposed white perpetrator versus like the innocent victim because he's black.
Yeah.
So I think that there's something to be said for that too.
Yeah, so Skolnick's first point about white privilege in the interview, right, isn't necessarily about why Trayvon Martin was targeted, but about the media coverage of this event, right? The fact that it was only black commentators, although he's corrected a little bit, it was primarily black commentators in the media who first brought attention to the case, that his white friends on Facebook didn't seem to be sort of excited about it and picking up this as an important issue, right? So his first sort of point about the place of white privilege in this case has to do with coverage and attention, right? What we pay attention to, what we as a society understand to be extraordinary or a momentous event or an important issue we're paying attention to. There were two hands. I'll take them real quick. Yeah.
What I got from what he was saying is it's deep white privilege. He was drawing that card, and whether you know it or not, when you're white, you have that privilege, and you're not suspicious no matter where you go. If you're in a restaurant, if you've got a hoodie on, so the white privilege, being white, is always there. And you're never suspicious. You never thought of it being suspicious because you're white. So you don't get categorized as a thief or something like African Americans do, just because of coloring the skin. So, we typically categorize people in categories of just being white. You have that privilege, and you don't even have to do anything to have it. It's just there all the time. That's what I got from what he was saying. You have that privilege.
Yeah, and that's very much there.
Kind of that same thing. At the very end, I believe I heard Skolnick, he was saying, I believe that Zimmerman is innocent until proven guilty, and she has to be processed, and so on and so forth. And at the very end of the clip, the commentator, I don't remember his name, he was saying that I agree with you, and a lot of white people do as well. As opposed to, which implies the opposite, that because he has this white privilege, he is innocent until proven guilty. Whereas if you're not white, that's not the case. Which is something I believe I heard him say that.
Yeah, I have to think more about what's
It's like
going
the
on.
last
in that
5
moment.
seconds.
Yeah, I believe the interviewer is Don Lemon, right? That was maybe not. I think he works for CNN. Okay, so I just sort of wanted to do this partly to finish off the lecture from Monday, also to give you some sense of where we're looking for you to go with the quizzes. So it's not just a regurgitation, but it's also just not your own opinions, right? In this case, I'm wanting you to tie that response to Skolnick, right? What does Skolnick think? What is he telling you in the reading or in the interview about these issues? So I want really quickly to go over some answers from the quiz, the group quiz Monday. So the first question was, and you can take back out your quizzes and grade yourselves, and I'm curious sort of how people did. The number of people in the U.S. in prison, in jail, or on probation or parole is closest to the population of, how many people said New York City, Los Angeles, Chicago, anyone say Dallas? Any Dallases out there? Correct answer, New York City, 8.1 million. Actually, this is not even totally current. As of 2005, there were over 7 million people in the U.S. in prison, in jail, or on probation or parole. So that number's gone up significantly since then. That number reflects about what percentage of the number of adults in the U.S. population. Now, it's interesting, whenever I give these two questions, a lot of people get the first one right, but tend not to get the second one right. I think it's just overestimating the size of New York City. So, did anyone say D, 1%? There's some 1%. Yeah, it's 1%. It's actually a lot of people, if you think about it, it's 1 in 100. 1 in every 100 Americans are in prison, in jail, on probation, or parole. At the state level, nonviolent drug offenses account for what percentage of prison sentences? A, B, answer B, C, few, new answer D. The correct answer is C. Again, nonviolent offenses make up about 49% at the state level, but nonviolent drug convictions are only 21%. So again, there's a lot of things that happen in the rhetoric around prisons. One of them, particularly among critics of the prison, is there's an attributing of the increase in imprisonment to the war on drugs. And people therefore tend to erroneously assume that many more people in prison are there for drug offenses than is actually the case. And we can talk a lot about why that happens, and how even the people who are in there not for nonviolent drug offenses are still there largely because of a system that's been built up around the fear of drugs and the war on drugs. If arrested for a drug offense, who is more likely to be convicted, a man or a woman? Who said a man? Who said a woman? A few more than the other one. Who said both? That way. It's actually a woman. Why might that be? These folks. Why are women more likely to be convicted of drug offenses if arrested than men? Yes?
Less chance of error than men.
Less chance of?
Men would probably be picked out wrongly more than women. Yeah.
Ah, so maybe they're more likely to be guilty if they're arrested and charged?
I think so,
Yeah.
I would guess maybe you have children involved, and their parents, or they're with their children using drugs, so the stigmatization of that, those two things combined to create them more.
Yeah, both of those come into play. There's a stigma, not just of drugs, but of women in general who end up in contact with the criminal justice system. There's a stigma attached to women that's not necessarily attached to men in the same way. And so courts and police and DA's offices tend to deal with them more harshly. And that's even more the case of mothers, right? So women who are arrested for drug-related crimes are often also charged or threatened to be charged with child endangerment, particularly if the drugs are present in the house. That's often used as a way to coerce women into plea deals, so they're more likely to plead guilty than men. So there's a lot going on there. Yeah?
Also, statistically, women are more likely to commit nonviolent offenses than violent offenses compared to men, and so statistically, like the number of drug offenses would be significantly higher within the category of women than violent offenses that are committed.
Yeah, although this is more, I know the wording is confusing, but this is more about odds than actual numbers. So, but yes, that is true. Yeah, women are much more likely to commit, to be arrested for nonviolent offenses, as opposed to violent offenses than men. Yes?
Wouldn't they also kind of like take the blame for if they get caught with like the drugs and stuff like that over the men? Like the guys would ask the girls to do it, like say yes, I was the one who was doing the drug dealing and stuff like that instead of the men.
Yeah, it's related to that. It turns out that women who are arrested for drug-related offenses, particularly dealing or carrying, smuggling, different kinds of possession, are often in very low levels within drug organizations. And so they tend not to have a lot of power within the organization. They tend not to be very protected by the organization. So they're much more likely to be kind of left out to dry, or to be told to take the rap, right? For the sake of either boyfriends or husbands who they don't want to see get a third conviction, what have you. Right? So there's a lot of sort of elements that have to do with women's relationships to men in their lives that also play into this.
Also from the reading for this week, sometimes like the lawyers wouldn't like necessarily tell their whatever people that they're defending like what's going on because they think they might be uneducated. Some lawyers may there may be a stigma thinking that like women would be uneducated
Yeah, there's definitely different treatment that they receive in terms of being informed about their rights, being informed about their legal options, much less likely to be treated as an equal partner in the defense process.
Sometimes there's also issues of there are so many more men in prison that there is sometimes they're let go or they're lesser charged because there's literally no place to put them. So sometimes that becomes a factor that women they actually the punishment is carried out because they can they just have a physical space in which to carry it out.
Yeah, and I'd have to think about that more and do some research to find out if that's the case. It seems plausible. There are overcrowding issues in many women's prisons as well, but they are. But the main part of this, and a lot of these speak to this, is that women are simply more likely to be charged with higher offenses and are more likely to be plead guilty, right? So there's a lot of guilty pleas to more severe offenses than in the case of men. We're going to talk more about that. We have some readings coming up later in the term about women in prison. So how did the average length of drug sentences change between 1980 and 1992? This was in the slides, increased 1,000%. From 1980 to 90, drug-related arrests for non-whites increased 150%, while drug-related arrests for whites stayed roughly the same. So we can think about, where were those? So we can think about those two statistics when we come back to Weaver and thinking about Bechtel Weaver's piece on front lash. Right, so she outlines in her essay how the sort of national and legislative attention and presidential attention toward crime as a political issue arises in the late 1960s. Largely, she argues, in response to civil rights gains. So we can think about then why it is the case that arrest rates do what they do in the 1980s. Blacks account for what percentage of those sent to prison for drug-related offenses? Who said A? Who said B? C? There's some C's. The correct answer, as you know from the other slide, is D. And what was the rate of incarceration for black men in the United States in 2008? The answer to this was hidden in one of the graphs. 1 in 15. Just high. Just so you know. And which of the following ethnic groups, we talked about this one as well. Southeast Asians have very high incarceration rates in the United States. And why do you suppose that might be? This is one that stumps a lot of people, including a lot of researchers. Yes?
Some of them are refugees, and they might not have the same political rights in the U.S. as refugees.
Yeah, so there are a lot of particularities to the Southeast Asian population in the United States. It's largely a refugee population. Of course, Salvadorans also, many came as refugees. Cuban Americans, many came as refugees. So they're not unique in that sense, but it plays a part in this. I mean, their sort of unique status as refugees who came at a certain time. I don't remember the order of those hands. 1, 2, 3.
A lot of these are Vietnam vets. So being Vietnam, there's a lot of vets that still have negative connotations as Southeast Asians as the enemy. So they'll be focusing more on them and their friends. They'll be focusing more on the quote-unquote enemy. They spent every day for 8 to 10 years, or 5 to 10 years fighting.
So possibly police perceptions related to Vietnam War and Vietnam service.
Also, that they're just newer, they're less established as a refugee group, and I think a lot of xenophobia, and that you see generationally as migrant populations are entering the U.S.
So the sort of recentness of arrival is definitely.
I was thinking food trafficking. Getting out, working to get out of Cambodia or wherever you're from,
Yeah, there definitely are sort of popular cultural representations of Southeast Asians, and we see Gran Torino, right, as different from other, particularly other Asian American groups.
Could you please clarify the term rate of incarceration? Is that a ratio or a percentage?
Rate. So the percentage of their population that is in prison in relation to the percentage of other people. So it's not absolute numbers. So what I'm saying here is that African Americans have the highest rate of incarceration. Cambodian Americans have the second highest rate of incarceration, not the second highest numbers in prison, but the second highest rate of incarceration in relation to their population. So one last, yeah. Not so much, since they're mostly not Islamic. I think a big part of it has to do with, so the refugee says, but the timing of the refugee influx from Southeast Asia is particularly important. So you're absolutely right. They come in. Immigrant groups tend to come in sort of the bottom rung, so societally, when they arrive. In the case of Southeast Asians, when did they start arriving in large numbers in the United States? You would know. Mid to late 70s, right? So right around the time when the big upswing in incarceration is happening, right? So there's bad timing there. There's bad timing for Southeast Asians when they arrive in the United States. Other possible explanations have to do with sort of language barriers and cultural barriers that were particular to the Hmong population that was involved. It was very highly represented in this group. The truth is, there's not a lot of research on this set of data, and so there are not a lot of hypotheses other than the ones that you've already given, and sort of one about timing that I gave. Yeah.
There's like specific immigration laws that will have you deported because of a sentence or a conviction that you had previously or that you currently have.
Yeah.
And so he also lists the immigration law about the immigration law. So just to get just an easy way to get
Yeah, no, the immigration changes to immigration law, particularly in the mid-1990s, affected a lot of populations of immigrants, especially Mexicans, but also largely Southeast Asians were also very affected by that. So moving along, that was the group quiz. Nice and fun, no grades. Oh, did anyone get all of them right? Did groups get all of them right? Did groups get 9 out of 10? 8 out of 10? Oh, yay! I was just curious, All right, so today I'm going to give you the first quiz.